Hello, everyone. Welcome another week to this Collateral Onboarding call number 8, held on Wednesday, September the 16th at 5 p.m. UTC. My name is Juan. I'm with 18 other participants that are interested in Maker in a way or another. Today we're going to talk about real-world assets. So we have this special edition. We're going to have the first half of the call. Lucas from Centrifuge present again. We have seen him a couple times, but it's good to reinforce and be able to discuss more about it. And same thing for the second half, when we will have Matthew Rabinovich from Success Capital presenting his project. So, well, more on a personal note, I think that what I want to see, and I think everyone else joining me here, we want to see real world assets in the platform, not only the community, but the community at large. So almost everyone, there's like a pressure. So we want to see a little bit of progress. I think we have a lot of information scattered. We have a lot of industry experts, a lot of people that have a say. So we're at the point where we need to organize and structure a working plan and move things forward. Seb Derivo has posted a thread to make a working group. It's posted on the agenda. So hopefully this will help move things forward, have people rally around it, maybe have regular calls, have a clear action plan. I don't know, Seb, if you would like to comment on it before going to Lucas. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of leading this working group to find a way to get real-world assets on Maker as soon as possible, and mainly to offer a third view, because we have Centrifuge, which propose one kind of collateral, many collaterals, by the way, and Success that propose something a bit different, but still a real-world asset. And I want to explore a third way to try to find how we can merge those kind of assets to get real-world asset on Maker as soon as possible and in the better shape for all Maker.
So yeah, to add a little bit and to answer on the questions on the chat, Frank asked if this meeting is happening every Wednesday. So not yet, but ideally we would leave with some action points. That could be one of them. And again, there's this forum post that Sebastian posted. So ideally we would get people rally around that and get something concrete going on.
Yes, there is a Google Doc that will be expanded, and everyone is free to comment on it. And if you want to write something on it, I can give you the right access. It's not a problem.
Yeah, I think Juan, I would definitely support doing it at least every other week, a real world asset focus call. And so Seb, your proposal of sort of using the working group as a vessel for that, I think is a good idea.
Sure. Maybe you want to kick it off, Lucas, with your presentation?
Yeah, I can. I have some very basic slides, mostly so I don't forget, and I can share a few things. Here, just set that up. Okay, so I think I'd like to spend mostly time explaining sort of the process we followed so far and what we plan to do, or what we hope to do going forward together with the Maker community. I want to give a little bit of a background of what we do, but there's actually a lot of material out there on our end, but then also in like previous collateral onboarding calls where we were presenting, discussing certain topics. So this call, to put it very simply, just for the people that don't know about Centrifuge, Centrifuge is a set of technology that allows asset originators to bundle different loans in form of NFTs, create pools of assets, so sort of securitize them and issue tokens against them that sort of represent a share in this pool. These tokens are interest bearing and sort of entitle the holder of these tokens to an interest in the pool, and also in sort of in case of default, of course, a recourse on the assets that are backing this pool. So you can think of it as a way for an asset originator to take many of these different real world assets, such as invoices or like real estate, mortgages, any kind of thing, sort of any kind of asset that you can give a price, bundle them, and sort of have this more scalable, more lower risk structure. And we have 5 asset originators that are proposing, sort of have submitted MIP6 proposals that allow these to sort of start this process of onboarding these assets to Maker. I've mentioned before, we have like freight shipping invoices, real estate, inventory, trade finance, and we're sort of looking into sort of all these different kinds of assets, because of course we believe that like as a big variety of different real world assets is in the end what a system like Maker needs. And so we've been working with different ones. And so maybe just to talk a bit about what we've done so far, I mentioned the 5 proposals. We have 4 pools live outside of Maker where we've originated 2.4 million DAI in the last 4 months. We went live in May with sort of this product mostly focusing on direct investors buying these drop tokens and investing in these assets. These were all settled in crypto, also settled in DAI, and so the borrowers actually got DAI, and the investors got their interest paid in DAI, and so on. This is sort of based on what we've been doing with sort of very closely with the Maker community for over a year now. We did our first sort of transactions with other asset originators, New Silver, and for example, at the time was our first transaction that we did together. So showing how this could in the future lead to real world assets being onboarded into Maker, but also sort of all of DeFi, because of course, by bringing real world assets into DeFi, we have the potential to scale this entire ecosystem, not just by a factor of maybe 1 or 2, but by a factor of several thousand times, of course. So fast forward to where we are today, we've actually been sort of working with the domain teams, but also on our own, by ourselves, sort of trying to find issues, questions, and propose solutions. And we've published a few formal MIP proposals and informal blog forum posts to sort of start these different discussions. And we now sort of in the last couple of weeks, we've come to a point where sort of, I think objectively we can say that Centrifuge is ready, the asset originators are ready, and I hope to a point as well, or at least that is my understanding of the Maker community, that we are ready to actually talk about onboarding these assets concretely. And so we've put forward a declaration of intent, this MIP 13, that talks about sort of how we want to start this onboarding process. And this should sort of lead up to a collateral onboarding application that is sort of similar to the current MIP 12, but is modified slightly to be more specific on on the questions that you have to ask and answer on the real world assets. In parallel, sort of MIP 22 is a proposal that we did that came out of solving one of the trickiest questions in real world assets, in this topic of bringing real world assets into Maker, which is how you can liquidate a vault that needs to be liquidated. And so MIP 22 goes into how, instead of trying to use on-chain keepers for that, actually we have a way that sort of how our smart contracts are structured, we can either liquidate these assets off-chain, refinance these assets off-chain. So just find another bank, for example, that will want to extend credit against these assets, or just let them age to maturity, which is actually a lot of times not even that long. For example, our sort of console freights invoices have an average maturity date of less than 45 days. So it's actually quite fast to just let this portfolio sort of mature and liquidate it through that. And so this is sort of the third piece that's in progress, or in the request for comment phase. So we're here right now, maybe a little bit more. This graphic's a bit outdated. So we are in the request for comment phase for these two MIPs, and sort of working on the MIP that will onboard some of this first collateral. Going into detail a bit, the MIP 13 declaration of intent is a way for the maker community to declare something. What does that mean? It means that a statement is sort of written, iterated on together with the community, and then brought forward to a vote on chain. And so then in the governance cycle, MKR holders are able to vote. And so the way we're using this is sort of to think of it as a term sheet, that the maker community can say, okay, we roughly agree with the process that Centrifuge is proposing to bring these assets online, and sort of to follow this process of onboarding these assets. And so you can read the MIP 13 component 3 subproposal 5, which is our specific declaration. And sort of in 4 bullet points, what we're proposing is we're saying we want to start small, meaning around 5 million DAI debt ceiling per collateral type, no more than 15. The reason why is not because that's where we see the sort of the maximum potential of what we can add. In fact, that's way more. But this is a way that we can start small at a low risk, and sort of grow as a maker community, grow and learn from this entire experience. It'll allow us to be faster, move faster, and learn faster, instead of sort of being maybe a bit being like stifled by this sort of by all these huge questions and trying to do it in one huge thing, maybe being a bit too perfectionist. The second component is that we will be supporting this as much as we can as Centrifuge. Centrifuge has a team of software engineers that have extensive experience writing smart contracts. We also are very familiar with Maker and Maker's code base. And so I think we're in a good position to actually do a lot of integration work ourselves. That doesn't mean we don't need any help from the domain team and sort of the team that is designing large parts of the smart contracts. But this is something where we can sort of help speeding up this work. A part that really is critical, of course, is the risk parameters of these different collateral types. And it would be a clear conflict of interest if Centrifuge would try to come up with that for our asset originators. And so we definitely want to work with the risk team sort of to propose these parameters and make sure that we there have a sort of an externally validated risk model that we can use, that the community agrees on, that we can use sort of to move forward. So this is the process we intend to follow, and it's explained in a bit more detail in the forum post, sort of in the MIP. And I'd love to answer questions, modify it, sort of extend it as it goes through this current governance cycle. Then, sort of based on this declaration, the component we're working on now is MIP, I call it XX just because we don't know the specific number yet, but this is intended to, and I'm not looking at the chat, but I can try to jump in if there's something, or maybe if you want to interrupt me, feel free to interrupt me for questions as well. But yeah, so this MIP is really, is what MIP 12 component 2 does for assets like Wrap, Bitcoin, and KNC and 0x token. So it's the final executive vote that the DAO will decide on to onboard a specific collateral type. So it's the spell, the spell that will onboard this collateral if enough MKR voters vote on it. The work that sort of has to be done, of course, in governance to go through this is sort of doing the risk model, doing the audit of the smart contracts, doing so setting up this spell and publishing it. And so in a way, this follows is very similar to I've posted an example here, and I can share those slides later, to what like a collateral onboarding would look like for a crypto asset. And so, but it will be slightly different in differences that I'll go into in a bit. So this is really the final milestone, and our goal is to get to that final milestone with 1 or 2 first assets as soon as possible. We all know that we need to sort of scale the DAI supply significantly, and I think the community is convinced that real-world assets is one way to do it, a good way to do it. And so this is what Centrifuge is sort of focusing on right now in sort of pushing this process forward. So I want to highlight a few of the key differences between the regular MIP6 to MIP12 process and what we're proposing. We talk a lot about, we had a lot of chats and forum posts and calls about the differences, just how real world assets work and how crypto assets work. I would, if you're interested, go look at them. Happy to answer specific questions as well. But this might be a bit too much in detail for some of the audience, and so I would recommend you like sort of dig through the forum posts a bit to catch up. But let me jump right in here. So one key difference is that actually the vault owner is not anybody sort of wanting to use a maker system, but the primary vault owner here is the asset originator, because the asset originator wants to use maker to access liquidity to originate loans. This has a huge advantage. We know how much DAI demand there is because we can ask the asset originators, how many loans do you want to issue in the next 6 months or year or whatever? And this will give us a way that, provided sort of they can get an attractive rate from maker, the originations are predictable and stable and actually scale, right? And so this is a thing that we've sort of seen with other ERC20 tokens where even though there could be like several hundred million in market cap, ERC20 tokens, they only generate a few 100,000 DAI in supply. And so this big advantage of sort of working directly with the asset originator actually means we know how much DAI we can generate. Another sort of difference is, of course, these assets are largely illiquid, but also very stable. So that means we won't be trying to feed in like exchanges or sort of real-time market data to find out what the price of these assets are, but that is rarely needed. So our Tin Lake pools have a way to calculate a NAV model, the NAV on chain. NAV is just net asset value, sort of which means it tries to determine the current value of all of the assets in this pool. It takes into account, for example, factors in probability of default and sort of expected revenue, so interest revenue that is owed by borrowers, and can price the entire pool. So from maker's perspective, it can look at that NAV model, and if it determines it to be accurate, then that can be used as a price source. For now, this model is largely built on self-reported data by the asset originator, and that means that it does require due diligence of these asset originators and some amount of trust in them. And this is often how it's done with sort of lenders, sort of these asset originators, borrowers going to a bank and asking for a line of credit to build out a lending business. In sort of what we want to do, and this is maybe a thing where I'm talking about, right, moving quickly now at a small scale and then sort of iterating on the process to scale up, is that in the future, the goal can be that we can have this data that the asset originator reports be verified by third parties and have oracles that provide this data on chain. And so this could be, for example, data like the credit score of the borrower. If it's a consumer, it could be a real estate estimate, or it could be like some other kind of asset. Liquidation, I've mentioned this is a MIP22, and I see I'm running a bit over time, so I want to end it quickly. But liquidation, there's a specific way we liquidate these because there's no liquid market. The best way is to have the asset originator refinance these loans or let the portfolio mature. And so the liquidations work slightly differently, and this survey published in MIP 22. Again, please ask your questions and sort of engage here. The risk work, we are sort of still needs to happen, and that's where we have been working with the asset originators to provide like data package on as much information that we can give to sort of determine what this should be. And there's different inputs that we're sort of providing. We have the asset originators underwriting process, so how they make decisions themselves. We will ask them to publish information about their past performance, but also competitive offers. So a lot of them have offers from banks, reputable banks, sort of showing, okay, like this is a realistic cost of capital for them. But then also we can look at sort of what the industry performance is. And we're hoping that we can sort of work with the Real World Asset Working Group here in finding a way that we can define these and sort of get a risk assessment by the community. So sort of taking these differences all together will ultimately result in this MIP that will outline exactly how this asset should be onboarded, what risk parameters will be proposed. And as Sebastian mentioned, I'm proposing that we will meet every other Wednesday at the same time we're meeting now. So alternating with the Collateral community call that we've been doing and sort of discussing these points. So that's it on the sort of process overview. It's a lot of information, but I hope I can sort of gives you a bit enough an idea where we are right now and what the potential is. And here's just some contact information. We're on the forum, we're on chat, and of course also by email.
Does anyone have any questions? I can maybe start with one, Lucas. I've heard from, well, when discussing Centrifuge, I heard that there's an additional risk because token emission happened on a sidechain. So I'm not very familiar with Centrifuge model, but maybe you can comment on this. Maybe I'm wrong, but
the token emission happens all on Centrifuge, on Ethereum. So all of this data that I've talked about, the tranches, the like data model, the NAV model, that's all on Ethereum. This might change in the future because right now it costs us around $30 to $50 to originate a loan in gas fees, and so that's obviously not something that's sustainable when you're thinking of doing like smaller loans. But for now, we're doing this on Ethereum.
Does anyone have any questions that you would like to ask or any comments?
Yeah, I have one. I thought that on your website you need to have some KYC for your investors. So would that be needed for Maker, or is it not important?
No. So the goal. So obviously not, because how would you KYC Maker? Maker is not a legal entity, and so the structure legally, and we will be sort of sharing information of the lawyers that we've worked with and sort of how they've assessed this. But in summary, the idea is that Maker itself is not a legal entity. And so if you're buying these tokens that represent a share of a security, then of course you will have to go through KYC and you're acquiring a regulated security token. Maker, when an asset originator deposits these assets as collateral in the DAO, it is not actually issuing the security because you're merely using it as an escrow, and it never leaves this decentralized entity. And so because of that, we don't have this issue that we would need to KYC every, like Maker DAO as an entity, or like think of KYCing every DAI holder, which would be even worse. So roughly, the idea is that this is, so the security transfer only happens if it would go to an individual person, which with Maker is not the case. But, and I'll share, there's some discussion in the forum about that as well. And our lawyers are still working on sort of the final version of the contracts that we're using, legal contracts, and I'll share that as soon as we have it, along with some more documentation.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, Lucas, do you think it would be possible for you to share some of the data that the asset originators are collecting in terms of like those industry numbers and the different reports and past performance? Even like, I'm not saying like the actual values of the data at this stage, but mostly like the data fields that are being collected for reference.
Yeah, we have, I think it may be out of the scope for right now, but I have, so we have been sort of starting to structure this a bit more. All of our asset originators have been providing this data and are sort of getting it ready. This would be a question for us, sort of to the Maker community, what is like the best format for us to do this in? Like we can set up a Google Drive with some like anonymized information that you could look at publicly. Definitely the asset originators, some of them have already been on calls and sort of answered questions directly. This is something we can do as well. Just sharing PDFs, like we're planning to do everything, but yeah, definitely we'll do that. And
yeah, whichever way actually works for you. Okay. I guess it would just be good to have a look at at the data dictionary and see if there is any missing gaps in there that would be required for an assessment, I guess.
Yeah, we can do that.
I was going to comment on that actually, Lucas. Maybe it would be good, and not a comment for you, but more for the working group to have like very clear steps on what do we have, what's next, what do we need from all the like risk point of view, the technical point of view, any MIP that should be approved for it to happen, and maybe do like an FAQ section where we can post these questions with answers and supporting documents. Like start a wiki somehow. I think it would be very useful.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, if there's no one else, maybe we can jump to Matthew Ragiewicz and his presentation. Are you ready, Matthew?
I'm ready. Anybody else have any other questions for Lucas? No. All right, then I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully not crash my computer in the process. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
All right, so I am Matt Rabinowitz for Success Capital, referencing the credit facility for today. Now that we're getting a little bit further in the weeds, my attorney made me put up a disclaimer, so you guys can spend your time reading it some other time. But summary is, this is not a securities offering. Anything that would be a securities offering will be in an offering memorandum that goes to a would-be investor, of which that's not the objective of this call. All right, so kind of like before, goal is just to see where we're going to be headed and why are we doing this. And it's fundamentally to expand DAI, to make it a capital sink, to help provide natural market liquidity providers that pull the peg back down to 1 or to 1, depending on the direction. But it ultimately is the ultimate layer 2 implementation of DAI. It's getting it off chain and letting it be circulated 10 times or 10 million times. So fundamentally, please, everybody ask questions, public, private, multiple conference calls, whether or not we're doing this on the forum posts. Feel free to reach out to me personally, etc. It's important to get everybody engaged in this, not only for my proposal, for Centrifuges, for the next 5 that come after that. The only way this is going to work is if we really optimize the solutions and make it work better for everybody. So what are we trying to accomplish? We're ultimately, on my end, trying to accomplish getting a secured DAI loan and providing a secured DAI loan to projects that have a known credit quality. So how are we doing this that's different? We're using structures and legal agreements that are seasoned, commonly used, and battle tested. Nothing we're using or discussing is new in terms of legal structuring. Most importantly, Lenco never actually touches die. I'll get to that asterisk in a moment. What is fundamentally different is while using common structures and common agreements, we're taking input variables from MKR governance. That's the difference. So in a big picture, we have smart contract risk and everything else, legal market risk. So if whether or not it's from Maker or the TFE or the trust, Lenco has an account at an OTC desk, but it never actually takes possession itself. It's just for the benefit of Lenco. In that context, everything that happens from a smart contract perspective of Maker is largely, I would use the word almost agnostic. It's very relevant, but not relevant for Lenco. It just happens, which is somewhat what makes it elegant. Lenco then does its fundamental operations pursuant to agreements that it has with the trust and why it could borrow money in the first place to deploy capital into would-be borrowcos that are in specifically scope-approved, MKR governance-approved structures, specifically credit quality, credit tenant leases. So again, let's switch our perspective. If this structure has been used before, this is not new. In this scenario, a trust is being created. The trust is the lender. The trust is the representative body of all MKR holders. Lenco is now the borrower, taking that money from the trust and then using that money to then turn around and lend to would-be borrowcos. And there's a credit agreement between the two with an asset collateral pledge between them to secure the loans. This is nothing new. So today, in the world of credit tenant leases, what's done is you take a bank, you take some private cash, private equity, preferred capital, and put it in borrowco. You get 100% of the budget, a bank puts in 70%, you can do your project. From the eyes of a developer who has multiple projects, you have lots of paperwork, lots of different banks, lots of different equity structures. This is hard to scale. From the eyes of Maker, if we were to do every one of these projects from Maker, we'd be having to have a vault into our own scenario, which equals, in my mind, MKR cognitive overload of how we would handle multiple quantities of vaults. So how does this evolve? It evolves by having a centralized structure that already has raised equity that gets married with a Maker facility into one centralized structure that gets audits, that gets inspection, that has inspection rights, that then turns around and lends money out to the would-be projects. All of those projects will have scope approved, tenant approved, so the credit quality will be known. From the eyes of a developer, they just see 100% loan to cost from a would-be lender. From the eyes of a debt facility, from a senior debt facility, and right now I'm making it generic, whether or not the capital is 100% or whether or not some of it's done with equity, the objective is that the senior lender is identical. Whether or not we have a bank involved or it's Maker, the objective is that the risk profile is the exact same. So from the eyes of Maker, there's a senior lending facility that has a senior lien equivalent into 6S Capital Partners, which has a senior lien into every one of these singular projects. If there's ever a default, the senior lender facility is senior to everything and wipes everybody else out. So how do we do this on scale from a 6S Capital perspective? We do with an execution team and we break everything down into phases. Different tenants, different structures, just like we're building an aircraft. We start off by figuring out how much we're going to need in terms of time. We make the developer, the borrower in this case, they do all of the front-ended research, they do all of the development work that we never even see or touch. We only show up with capital when we have a shovel-ready project. When the lender can have a senior lien on the project and a general contractor is committed to do the projects. Projects can last anywhere from between 6 months to 18 months, and between 18 to 24 is the divestiture period. And at that point, all capital is returned and recycled. So fundamentally, phase one, real estate research. This is where developers go out and find selection. They're negotiating with people. They're building up a package to share with a tenant to get their blessing. Who takes the risk? The developer. Senior lender and the investor don't touch anything here. Same thing on the development stuff. They engage with tenants. They work on getting together a package and executing the build-to-suit and the ground lease. The developer takes all of this risk. The senior lender touches nothing here. We talk about when there's a shovel-ready project is at the point where everything has culminated to the point where there is an actual closing, where there is a guarantee in favor of the lender, where there's a general contractor committed. The land is simultaneously acquired into a newly formed LLC. In exchange for the capital to do all of that, 6S receives a senior lien over the entire project with all of the assignments. It's at this point the project switched from a developmental risk to a construction and an execution risk. Now we're building the project. This takes, as I mentioned before, anywhere between 5 to 18 months, depending on the scope of the project and the depth. Some of them have much more horizontal construction that are otherwise needed. And at the very end, the developer is incentivized to divest and dispose of the project. The developer makes $0 until the project is sold. When the project is sold, the senior lender, 6S Development, is repaid, and whatever's left over goes to the developer. 6S Capital at that point takes the capital and can either A, recycle it back into the next project, or B, pay down the maker line. So let's evaluate like the 3 fundamental big picture risks, and these are clearly not totally comprehensive. Again, my attorney made me say it. Fundamentally, we've got smart contract risk, legal risk, tenant risk. So let's go through those. Now, these are all the legal contracts. So smart contract risk. So if we were to just break this down, like what happens if Lenco loses his private keys or they're compromised? Lenco never touches the die. So largely all Lenco does is cause the die to be moved, but never actually takes possession of it. In that same regard, if there's a smart contract that's found, a defect that's found in that entire cycle of how die is moved around, we just simply stop using it. There's no capital exposure. We just wait till there's a fix that's been implemented. Same thing on the Lenco side. If there's a risk, we've mitigated the risk related to having a trust that's providing a loan by implementing a trustee with legal enforceability. And the same component for all of these, where every enforceability of the loan, a trust has a court of law, a standing in law. The trust can cause the foreclosure of any pledged collateral to recover proceeds. And one of my favorites, Lenco manager, me, gets hit by a bus, right? Trustee still always has the ability to foreclose. We're relying completely on the rule of law and having a senior lien on everything that allows the trustee to recover everything on behalf of the trust that wipes out everything. Again, if there's fraud, I go to jail. If we do a bad deal, Lenco has to recapitalize itself before the determination period, or this whole project gets unwound and Lenco gets liquidated. When the money that gets hit first would be the equity, because 30% of the capital has to be in the form of equity for a new construction, as per my proposal, or 15% if it's already stabilized, meaning that we'd have to have if there's a liquidation, the senior money gets paid back first, and if there's a haircut, that goes down to the equity. So at the BorrowCo, what happens if there's a risk of bad title? Now, all of our closings are done through title companies that issue title insurance. We make sure that we have clear title and that the senior lender receives first position lien on everything. BorrowCo is exposed to operational risks. If there's a weather, what happens? Weather delays. Well, they have to wait, but they ultimately pay more interest. If there are overruns, the principals of BorrowCo end up having to inject more cash. They make nothing until the project is divested. Similarly with a labor strike, they have to deal with a general contractor. Now, all of those pieces we can mitigate. Now, the real question comes down to the market and tenant risk of what happens with pricing, because the piece that we can't de-risk is our tenants and how they run their operations. But we can decide which tenants we can select and why. Fundamentally, we're in the business of making money, and we need to borrow money to make money. So we are highly motivated to only pick creditworthy tenants, and we only get investors' capital because they believe in the structure we're putting forth, why we're not putting, right now in the middle of COVID, putting together movie theaters, which would be obviously catastrophic. So we can cause borrowers to have insurance. We can't obviously control the weather or the storms, but if there is an environmental issue that causes a massive destruction, insurance will reimburse them and they can continue with their projects. Worst case scenario, market conditions deteriorate and BorrowCo cannot sell the completed project, at which point LendCo forecloses on the project that is producing a yield which is better than the cost of capital that we're getting from Maker in the first place. We collect rent payments and continue to do so until we sell the project, which we're not in the business of holding projects, we're in business of lending for them. We wouldn't fire sale it, but we would divest it appropriately. And the BorrowCo would forfeit all of its profit. Now, the Maker risks involved in this really are what happens if the lender decides to go out of scope. And this is where a Maker representative engagement with the community and causing the executive vote to liquidate, the trustee steps in and liquidates the entire project. The real issue I think we're going to find in 6 months is just raw concentration between a large amount of DAI going into very few entities until there are, a portfolio, a cohort of 5 or 10 other equivalent LendCos out there that have substantial amounts of DAI to get people comfortable. Very similar to the stablecoin issue we have today with USDC. So let's compare and contrast. So assets, pros and cons. We've got ETH, it's decentralized, but it relies on lots of centralized on-ramps. WBTC, large market cap, but it's somewhat quasi-centralized custodian. We go down this list and real world assets, not specific to credit tenant leases, but just in general, using a trust and a LendCo structure, which is known and battle tested. As long as we price it correctly and competitively, we will have almost unlimited demand for credit. And then the issue turns into credit concentration and do only a few LendCos, well, initially 1 or 10. We wanted to get it to 10. It has many benefits, and the only con is that it's semi-illiquid. This piece I've already discussed, or I've shown this before. I'm happy to go through it. I don't think we can go through parts of it now. Fundamentally, the big key takeaway here is that Success Capital Partners, quote unquote, LendCo, ends up with a portfolio, a diversified portfolio of lenders, senior liens in a variety of different projects that are geographically distributed with different tenants. And that tenant list is expanding based upon the quantities of developers that want to use our services. So our proposed tenant selection today, and this will grow over time, we focused on a common ethos of Amazon resistant, recession resistant, and COVID-19 resistant. In fact, most of these have had a COVID-19 boost where they're growing in this environment, not declining. So our fundamental generic sequence, we've submitted our declaration of intent. We are in the process now of the community discussion. We'll get through a formal cycle here. The real important piece here is because we're talking about actual legal structures being implemented, and these structures are not cheap. In fact, they're very expensive. We are going to go through an executive vote, in effect, to approve the term sheet, as Lucas had outlined, of our MIP 13. And if accepted, which would be great, we're going to conditionally set the debt ceiling to 0. So we're going to vote on an actual number, but the implemented debt ceiling would be 0. So up until the very last step, the community is going to take basically 0 risk. It's only after the Success team, working alongside the Maker representative, put together and show the community all the documents, all the structures that have been implemented, then the community would have another executive vote to further basically ratify it, if you will, and then re-implement the previously approved debt ceiling going from 0 to whatever is approved. And at that point, Success would be able to borrow against it pursuant to the credit facility agreement, which has a whole lot of covenants that say that we can't borrow money unless we have a senior lien. We can't borrow money unless we've got equity deployed, etc. So next steps, join calls, ask questions. We got a pipeline ahead of us. We've got $10 million in projects basically waiting for the green light on this, and more for Q1. So with that, that's my contact email address and site. Take any questions folks have got.
Thank you, Matthew. Akiva, do you want to jump on the mic? And
Yeah, can you hear me?
yes,
I can.
So I just think it's best if you release some of the information about the trust in the trust agreements as early as possible, because not only does the maker community need to do diligence on your specific agreements, but for many people in the community, they may also be wanting to do some diligence on the more general space of trust law, so that we understand not only your proposal, but how it sits in the context of the more general law.
Understood. Yeah, the challenge, here's the biggest issue on that is we haven't selected the trustee yet, the trust company, and they're going to require us to use their form. There is no scenario where we present an agreement and say, is this okay? Use us. They have their own form. We don't get a choice on that. But the law that we're going to follow is the Delaware Statutory Trust. And that I actually put in one of the forum links. It's defined. There aren't that many changes we can make to it, but that trust agreements, the trust law is out there already. So Delaware Statutory Trust.
All right, thanks.
Matt, I have a question. So with the structure that you're proposing, maker governance gives you, I forgot the term that you used, but gives you basically a scope in which you can find projects and execute them, correct?
The scope and the specific list of tenants, correct.
Okay. And so can you explain like sort of how much of a bandwidth, or sort of how broad the scope is that you're proposing, or sort of how you want to work with the maker community to define this?
Sure. No. Yeah, it's specifically the credit tenant lease area of commercial real estate where it is a single tenant building where it either has a double net, triple net, or a ground lease, depending on the tenant. And that's a very nuanced, specific area, which is almost more like issuing bonds than it is. It's definitely nothing to do with building a high-rise building center and then hoping you have clients. This is, you have a contract, you know exactly what the tenant wants, you build it, and they are contractually obligated with their credit quality to pay the rent after it's been built. So in effect, from a tenant to a developer perspective, forget us for a second, from a tenant to a developer perspective, the tenant is looking at the developer as being almost their outsourced investment bank. They're almost creating a bond with these net lease properties, and that's how they trade in the market once they're stabilized. And these net lease properties are a very liquid market. They trade very closely in cap rates, depending on different geographies, but it's a very liquid market. Selling these is not an issue.
Okay, cool. Is there data that you could share about that? I'm just curious.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the CB Richard Ellis, they had, I think, $48 billion with a B dollars of net lease properties done last year. But I can send that. I can share that.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Matthew Frank Cruz on the chat says, can you please expand on what the maker representative will need to do, such as signing documents on behalf of the community, reviewing documents, report, etc.?
Yeah, so this is one where I very much want the community's insight on this, because the rub is going to turn into that 6S Capital as a lender comes in contact with confidential information. And some of that information, it just cannot share under privacy laws, period, end of discussion, with the public, quote unquote. And Maker is a public protocol, so we have to come up with some other mechanism that gets the community comfortable and also meets the legal obligations that 6S Capital has with would-be borrowers and tenants. So there aren't really per se execution documents that are needed. I mean, there's some formation components at the very beginning of establishing this trust, but let's just say that that's a one-off and minimal. The real engagement comes in from day zero. We have a project, the 10 million I outlined. Yeah, it's great, but I still want somebody else. I want literally 5 people from this call, 10 people from this call, all of you to be a maker representative, review the transaction in depth and report back to everybody else that you reviewed it also, that this is a legit transaction. Here are all the check boxes. Here's the package, we've reviewed it, and Matt's not getting a car out of this. We're just financing insert the name of the tenant location in Virginia, for example.
Is that an on-chain action? If like so reviewing the contracts is fine, but do you see that there would be a governance vote or sort of an approval on chain that would have to happen once these representatives review it, or
No,
or are you doing it differently?
That part is part of, I would call it version 2, or in the future. There are areas where we could do that. The question turns into what is the approved scope and how do we scale it? And to me, the model is really much more of not necessarily trust, but verify, and if you don't do it right, we liquidate. And liquidation on this scenario is so epically nuclear because it not only impacts Lenco, which obviously impacts me, it impacts all the borrowers, and it impacts everything that's downstream from that. That it's something that's so horrible that, you know, I'm hilariously paranoid to make sure that I will do unprecedented amounts of transparency to the point where I can with anybody that will execute a non-disclosure agreement to get them comfortable. Doing it on chain, it's something that's possible, but I actually see that almost introduces liability to a maker representative, and that's not really the objective. The objective is just to be a proxy, to be able to convey the equivalent of specific information in a translucent environment where it's more the substance, where all these boxes checked. Yes, did he do the annual audit? Did the audit come back clean? Okay, that part much we can do. Did you see that the money transferred from A to B to C? And this is the fund, this is the specific project that it went into? Yes. Okay, that's fine. But we don't have to release, for example, the borrowers who are borrowing from 6S Capital may very well have to share their personal financial statements with 6S Capital. None of that information is going to be public, can be public. It has to be private. So how do we operate? There's a smudge in the middle, and not having the maker representative be liable. That we will indemnify every one of them, but how much exposure do we want to have for that?
We do have a similar situation with the dark fix mechanism in Maker, where the protocol needs to trust someone. So maybe we can borrow concepts from that.
Yeah, and precisely. And over time, what ends up happening, and what I foresee happening, is that because 6S Capital Partners is forced by agreement to have a significant equity buffer per transaction, you know, the real risk is all in the first 6 months, right? After 6 months, there's no way anybody's ever motivated to breach anything. And moreover, the more projects you have, the more it smooths out any of the risk exposure for any one given project. So
yeah, so just in general, like my question, Matt, was I fully agree with you. Like sort of having an opt-in on every asset on every transaction would be. It's better to say like there should be a mechanism to halt something. It halts this whole mechanism if it goes out of bounds. And this is also, of course, what we're proposing with our asset originators, because I see that makes sense, and sort of to some extent, otherwise you end up overloading maker governance and even the representatives that you're proposing, right, to do too much. I have one other question that I couldn't quite understand from your setup is, do you have one shared equity tranche among all these projects, or is it just that each individual project has a piece of equity? So the question I have is like, if one of the projects is a complete default, will that just lead to basically 30% being covered, or would it lead to the equity from sort of the entire pool of assets sort of in this category be impacted?
The answer is it depends, right? So we are going to be set up with multiple tranches, but we have a fundamental requirement that we have to deploy the equity first into any given project that ultimately gets capital deployed. So if we go after, let's just pick, and we're not doing McDonald's, but let's just say we were doing a McDonald's, right? And the McDonald's needed, and I'm picking easy numbers for math because I'm tired. So let's just say it was $1 million. We have to deploy the 300 grand first out of equity first. And then the remainder comes out of the maker facility. Now, how we raise that equity is actually not almost, I know where you're going with it, but it doesn't even matter at that point, because what mattered was the fact there was a buffer, and the buffer is that there's $1 million worth of value, and maker has the first position on only 700 on the full $1 million of value, but they get 700 grand if it got sold. How we ultimately have multiple tranches of equity, preferred or super preferred or different costs of capital, that's, you know, it shouldn't even matter to a credit facility.
So I think I was going slightly somewhere else. What I was asking, so you have like two properties that you're developing, both of them worth $1 million, both of them with 300,000 in equity. So if one of them is a complete bust and is returned $0, Maker in the end would not be able to get the 600,000 that is equity from both projects, but that particular project is only covered by 30%. Is that, or is the equity structure, is the equity across all projects?
Yeah, it's across all projects, but I still don't understand where you're going with it, because the only way we ever deploy even a penny is if after we've gotten an appraisal of a stabilized project, right, that we know that we have de-risked it all the way down to just purely construction, execution risk, and really credit tenant risk, and somewhat divestiture risk, but really construction. So there's not really a scenario where a project goes down to zero.
I mean, but maybe I can reframe the question. If I understand correctly, the question is, are we doing a loan, a kind of loan to Success Capital? Or
Yes.
Are we doing individual loan to every project?
No, you're doing one credit facility agreement to Success Capital Partners.
So we don't really care what happened with the project, as long as Success Capital still have enough equity.
That's correct. That's correct. And as long as you know that equity moves first and that you have a senior position in every piece of dirt. Yes.
Okay, guys, as much as I would love to continue discussing these topics, I think it's, well, we're past the hour, so a lot of people need to jump to other calls. So we'll call it a day for today and regroup 2 weeks from now. Again, call to action, go to the forum and on Seb's post and sign up if you want to attend potential meetings and get documents. Yeah, next week we're going to have Mark Seller and Stani from Aave discussing their token, and then Tyler Winklevoss from Gemini discussing GUSD. That will be September 23rd at 5 p.m. UTC. Agenda will post it in the forum soon. And as always, if you would like to present any project, let us know. There's a special thread for that. And yeah, thanks again to Lucas, Matthew, and Seb and everyone else for participating. And let's keep the conversation going on in the forum.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
See you next week.
Have a nice day.